Hello, everyone. This is the Duolingo English Test with Penn English Language Programs. I'll introduce myself first so that the people who come in late will not miss the introductions of our wonderful guests. But my name is Ramsey. I'm an assessment scientist from the Duolingo English Test assessment research team. I have a background in psychology and education, and we're all very excited to discuss the questions we received from our social media followers in this first episode of Ask Us Anything. And we're talking about test readiness and English language learning with our two amazing guests from the University of Pennsylvania English language programs, Eve and Elizabeth, two experts in English language learning. Can the two of you introduce yourselves?
Hey, thanks, Eve. Thanks, Ramsey. Hi, everyone. My name's Elizabeth, and I've been helping individuals learn English at the Penn English Language Programs for about 11 and a half years now. I have a graduate degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and I'm actually currently working on my doctorate in educational linguistics. I'll pass it off to my colleague, Eve.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Ramsey. My name is Eve, and I'm a language specialist at English language programs at the University of Pennsylvania. And as a language specialist, that means I am an English language instructor. So I'm often working with students who are preparing for these types of tests to measure their English proficiency. And I've been with Penn ELP for about 10 years.
Wow, awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being here. You sound like the perfect guests to discuss these questions. So I'll just jump right into our questions. The first one we got was, how can I take the test in my home? What are all the things I need? And so I'll just say first, the kind of basic textbook answers are that you need a quiet place where you can take it without anyone else in the room. You need 1 hour of free time, an internet connection, a computer with a camera and a microphone, and also a test credit. So you need to have paid to take the test. But then I'll toss it to Eve and Elizabeth for any more advanced tips.
Thanks, Ramsey. So I think firstly, the fact that you can take it in your own home is a big benefit because you're in your space and you're comfortable. I also think you should prepare for the test in the same way you might prepare for an important soccer match. You wouldn't go into that cold without warming up. So you should warm up for any English proficiency test by doing a little English practice, whether that's listening to your favorite podcast or maybe reading a little in your favorite magazine or blog. And I also think you should try speaking a little in English. Even if there's no one there to speak to, it's really important that you warm up the muscles in your jaw, lips, and this area of your mouth so that you feel good using English on the test and that you feel ready. Eve, is there anything else you want to add?
I just add that the fact that you can take it at home and schedule it when you'd like, use that to your advantage. A lot of times we can't pick the day and time that we can take a test, an important test like this. And so know what time of day is most comfortable for you and schedule it then.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the sports analogy, and I agree it's about warming up. And it's kind of like doing vocal exercises before you sing. Like you want to be performing at your best during the test. So our next question is, would you please make an official course for the DET? Is there any special course for preparation for this test? So what do y'all think about that?
Well, this is a test that should be like a snapshot of your English language abilities and not necessarily something that we should be like studying for, right? So study English, yes, absolutely. Continue practicing with speaking and listening and reading and writing, but studying for the test itself may not be the best use of time. It is, however, a good idea to know more about the test. You don't want to be surprised in the moment. So there are resources out there that can teach you about the structure and the question types and the testing conditions and the security measures. DET has a readiness guide, and we also have a video series that we just released that talks about these aspects of the test. So that's a good thing to become familiar with. But as far as studying for the test itself, continue studying English. That's going to be the best way to perform well on the test.
And I'm just going to jump in and say the video series that Eve is talking about is a series of 10, 11 videos produced
11.
by the Penn English Language Programs about DET readiness. And Eve is your guide in the videos. She's the one who takes you through the ways you can prepare yourself and to be ready. And I just want to add, for any English proficiency test, working on your language is never wasted time. So we often get students who say, I don't want to waste my time on a reading course or on a writing course. I want to take a test prep course. And we just want to emphasize that that reading and writing course is also test prep, because anything you do to immerse yourself in English and improve your English is going to help you perform your best on that test.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Eve mentioned the Duolingo English Test. We have a readiness guide, which should be linked in the comments in the chat at some point. But I think our readiness guide really reflects that philosophy that, we're just encouraging people to engage with English, immerse themselves in English, and it's all about improving your genuine abilities in English. So next we have a question I'm very excited about. I think it's a very good question. How can I practice if my friends and family haven't mastered the language?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think Eve and I actually have a lot to say about it. I'll start and then hand it off to Eve to be more specific to the DET. But for proficiency testing in general, you really want to immerse yourself as much as possible. So you should choose input that is really meaningful and engaging for you. So I recommend finding a daily practice of a TV show or a podcast in English that you enjoy, and then making a commitment to listen or watch daily. So you get that reinforced repetitive practice. And I also recommend finding, a blog you like to follow in English, or a newspaper, or even a book if you like to read books. And that's really going to help with expanding your passive vocabulary and grammar, and really helping you with your passive repertoire. The missing piece is then being able to move those passive resources into active ones. So even without an interlocutor or someone there to practice with, I think you can force yourself, really commit or push yourself like you would push yourself if you're training for a big sports match, to maybe write a little in English about what you're reading or listening to. You can also record yourself. So a big activity we have our learners do is we have them give a little presentation or a little speech where they record themselves. And then they listen to that recording so that they can hear their own performance and learn to monitor their own speech for improvement. So that's for proficiency testing in general. I'll pass it off to Eve, who has more to say about how to practice for the DET.
Yeah, one of the things about the question types on the DET is that they mimic real life situations when using a second language. For example, the read aloud question on the DET, it asks test takers to read a sentence on the screen. Well, one way to kind of practice this is you can check your pronunciation using your smartphone. Most smartphones have like a voice to text function. And that can, if you're reading a sentence that you have in front of you into your smartphone, and your phone is having trouble with certain words that you're pronouncing, then you know that there might be a sound in that word that you might want to practice more of. So even if you don't have a person to interact with, there are some technologies. Another example might be the listen then write question, which asks you to type a statement that you hear. And this is something you can practice with anything that has closed captioning or a transcript. So television shows, podcasts, TV news, even English language videos on YouTube. So play a sentence, try to type it out, and then use the transcript to check your work. And so there are a few things you can do to prepare without a person, but of course, that authentic interaction is also really helpful for language learning in general. So I'd encourage you to find a speaking partner if you can.
Yeah, those are all great tips. I had not thought about speaking out loud to the phone and letting it transcribe, but I think that's a genius idea. And I know I've practiced my French with my Google Home. So that's another thing is like most smart assistants are, understand English. You can try to talk to them, and it's not exactly an authentic conversation, but it does get you to practice speaking out loud, being understood. Yeah, and I mean, I also talk to myself sometimes to practice second languages, just like think, how would I say this out loud? And then I just say it. I did have a follow-up question perhaps. So, is there anything wrong with practicing with another person who is not fully proficient in the language?
I think even I both probably have strong feelings. No, it's a really good thing to do. There's actually research that it helps your language. It doesn't harm your language when you practice with someone else who's also a learner. You tend to learn things from the person you're speaking with. And again, anytime you can push yourself to produce, you're really making important English connections in your brain that become stronger and stronger with repetition. So just the practice of doing it is really important. Eve, you probably also want to say something about this.
Well, it makes me think of like Bloom's taxonomy in general. Like I might passively know something, but the moment I have to explain it to somebody else, it's moving from the passive to the active, and it's deepening my understanding and my mastery of a certain concept. So absolutely, working with people of different levels can be really helpful.
And I just want to add, there's this fear that, I'll learn a bad accent from speaking with someone who has an accent. And that's just not true. They've looked at partner work, and that doesn't happen. And in fact, working with a partner is something we do frequently in the English language programs at Penn. We have partner work and group work because we know it's an effective way of learning and practicing.
I think we were kind of extending the sports analogy almost, like it's about, practicing the same thing and strengthening these like metaphorical muscles in your mind. Yeah, I'm sure, I think the three of us could probably talk about this one question for a long time. I have more thoughts, but I'll move on to our next question. And thank you to whoever submitted that question about practicing. That was great. So the next question is, what is the difference between the conversation and production subscores? How can I practice both? So I think I can just answer quickly that the conversation subscore is representing the skills of speaking and listening, and so that subscore is made up of scores on questions that are extended speaking questions, the audio yes/no vocabulary question where you have to pick real words after hearing them, the question where you have to listen and then write what you hear, and then the question where you have to read what you see written on the page. So practicing those particular question types will help the conversation subscore. The production subscore is even easier. It's just the speaking and the writing items. So the ones that require you to speak out loud and the ones that require you to write longer text. So improving those two question types will help the production subscore. Even Elizabeth, did either of you have anything else to add that's maybe not already been covered in other questions?
One thing I might add for speaking and writing, just to continue this sports analogy that we've started with, the idea of like filling the time. So a lot of students ask, like, how can I get quicker at this? And really, the answer is the same as with running, right? You can't decide tomorrow I'm going to run a 6-minute mile. You have to kind of work towards that. And so being familiar with the time frames that you're being asked to produce, whether that's speaking or writing, and timing yourself with those same constraints. So I think that might be something that can help specifically with the production subscore.
Yeah, that's a very good point, is getting comfortable with the time limits. Well, actually, yeah, the next question is sort of relevant to this question. What is your advice for practicing the speak about the photo question? And so that's the question where you're shown an image, a photograph, and then you're asked to just talk about this photo.
Well, one thing I would say is that pictures are everywhere, which gives us a whole lot to practice with, social media, your house, the news. There are a few grammatical structures that might help. So phrases like in the middle or next to the woman, in the lower left-hand corner, becoming familiar with how to place things within a picture could be very helpful. And again, I'd stress practicing with the timing. I don't remember the times off the top of my head for this picture, but I think there's like a minimum amount of time that a test taker should speak for, and then there's a maximum. And it's just a good idea to produce as much as you can and really fill that time. Sometimes the time constraints can feel really, really long, and sometimes they can feel really short, and it's just not a good idea to be surprised by that feeling on the test. So becoming familiar with that, using the readiness guide or the practice test can really help in those situations.
Yeah, and I just want to add, this is a great question type to practice recording yourself and then listening to the recording to hear what you notice in your speech, what sounds clear and strong, and what you could work on, whether it's just some phrases or whether it's working on vocabulary. And I can't emphasize enough what Eve said about filling the time. So don't hesitate to focus on details to keep the phrases coming.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful. I mean, the advice that we give is to describe the image as if you're describing it to someone who can't see it. And I found it helps me. I've had to do this question type on tests of other languages besides English. And, I realize I do this all the time. Like I talk to my partner or to my friends and I say, oh, I saw this really beautiful image on Instagram, or I saw this really funny image on Facebook. And then you describe the image as you saw it. So it's something that I think we do in real life that we don't necessarily realize that we do that frequently.
Yeah, if you're meeting somebody in a park and you can't figure out what do you see in front of you, right? You're trying to meet in the middle. It is, it's a linguistic task that comes up.
Exactly. So next we have maybe a more specific question, a more technical question. Hi, can I get accepted with an overall score of 95? So yeah, it's hard to give specific answers to this question, but I'll just say first that, different universities and even different programs, different departments within universities can have different requirements for these scores. And so if you have particular universities in mind, you should check their website. Yeah, and then I'll ask Eve and Elizabeth if either of you can say more about how the DET is used at Penn.
Sure, I'm happy to speak about that. I wish we had our colleague here, Eric Hyde, who's really knowledgeable about university admissions and testing for university admissions. So at Penn ELP, we use the DET as a placement test in our intensive program. And so there's a comment pinned here on Facebook that has our website URL, and you can go there to check out the intensive program. Just to note that if you're looking to improve your language quickly, an intensive program is the way to go because it immerses you for a significant amount of time every week. It really builds those muscles in both those connections in your brain and those other muscles you need for producing in English. But we use the DET to place you in one of our 8 English levels. And the DET is used in other departments at Penn, various summer programs for admissions. I think the thing to know about university admissions, at least at the graduate level at Penn, is that it's very decentralized. So different departments may make their own decisions about what their cutoff scores are for any proficiency assessment. So it's important that you be familiar with the department or the program you're applying to, specifically what they're looking for. And Eve, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think one thing to think about is the importance of that final section on the DET, this ungraded speaking and writing sample that I know I've been to a few webinars with admissions coordinators from various universities talking about to what extent they use those in their admissions decisions. And so considering that part of the test, while it is ungraded and not included in the score, it can be a way to show off your language skills. And so it's a good opportunity to think of those as almost like an audition for university.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just wanted to add, send you to our website again. I mentioned our colleague, Eric Hyde. He's part of our UNICON program, which stands for University Connection. And if you're looking for a really customized experience to help with university admissions, I think this program would probably be a good fit for you, because that's what they specialize in, is matching you with a university that's a right fit for not only your interests, but also your English level.
And he's got a blog. It's linked on the website.
Yeah, that sounds like a very useful service. I wish I had known about that when I was applying to undergraduate.
I should add, he not only has a blog, he also has a MOOC up on Coursera, a free course you can take on applying to US universities. So he's basically everywhere with advice on finding the best fit.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be very useful for a lot of people. And I guess maybe one or two other things I would add that came to mind is, that also admissions procedures, admissions requirements can differ between undergraduate and the graduate level. That's another thing to keep in mind. And perhaps, what I've heard is at the graduate level, there can be a little bit more variability between the departments, between the programs. But I'm also aware of schools at the undergraduate level that have different admission requirements depending on whether you're admitted without conditions or whether you're admitted but you need to take some supplemental English language classes. So it's another thing to keep in mind, is that there can be, lower admissions requirements if you're going to go into sort of an English program before going into the degree program. Next question, also related to admissions. Can the Duolingo English Test be used like IELTS or TOEFL for higher education applications? And so I can answer this one first, at least, is that yes, many programs, a growing number of programs, accept the Duolingo English Test as proof of English proficiency. I believe we passed 3,000 programs worldwide sometime last year. But again, you need to check the requirements of the schools you're interested in to choose which test will suit your specific purposes. And did y'all have anything to add?
I know students have asked me how the tests compare, and Duolingo has those equivalency charts. So taking a score that a person may have received in IELTS or TOEFL and how that compares, because the systems are all different. So it's good to know that resource exists too.
And maybe I'll just plug for a second. I know I've seen the advice online because maybe a lot of times students are applying to multiple schools, and maybe not all schools accept the Duolingo English Test. So it is certainly possible that you take another test for the schools that don't accept the Duolingo English Test, and then you take the Duolingo English Test for the other schools. The Duolingo English Test, it's free to share your scores with an unlimited number of schools. So it can still save students money, even if they have to take the TOEFL or the IELTS. It can be still advantageous to also take the Duolingo English test. So the next question is kind of getting back to more general language learning questions. And I've heard this question a lot, and I'm sure y'all have too. How can I improve my English quickly?
Okay, well, I think even I probably have lots to say about this, but it's going to be something you may have heard before. I think there's a lot of things you can do to improve your language efficiently, like immersing yourself in an environment. That's why we recommend a program like our intensive program. If you can't do that, there's a lot of things you can change about your environment to make it more English immersive. Like, for example, you can change the setting on your email so that it is done in English. I did that when I was learning Spanish. I'm going to say this again, find a podcast or a blog or a TV series whose content is really engaging and compelling for you, and make a daily practice of listening to it, because learning English, again, is like preparing or trying to improve at a sport. You have to build the connections in your brain by reinforcing them daily. And I think that we can't give you the magic bullet for making it happen quickly, but we can tell you that the more practice you do regularly, the more English endurance you'll build and the better your English fluency will get. And to, be patient with yourself, and to try to be proud of yourself for what you can do in English. Focus on what you can do, not what's lacking, because that's going to help motivate you and push you to keep up with that daily practice. So Eve, I know you might want to say more about the immersive environment.
I really loved what you said, Elizabeth. I don't have much to add. I just think that when you are immersed in an English-speaking environment, if you have the time and resources to travel and join an intensive program, there is a sense of urgency when you're living in a place where that language is spoken. And so it's again, no way to do it overnight. I can't decide I'm going to run a 6-minute mile tomorrow, but there are ways to be efficient, as Elizabeth said.
Well, one thing that just occurred to me, and I mean, I know I've used these in the past, is I've come across articles or lists that say, these are maybe the top 10 difficulties in language A for speakers of language B, like the difficulties that Spanish speakers have when learning English. Do you think that those types of resources are efficient or are useful for learners?
I find them interesting, just looking at different linguistic features, just because those lists tend to focus on things like sounds that exist in one language that don't exist in another, or structures that exist in one that don't exist in another. But I'm not sure that they necessarily help with like the acquisition of a second language, but I do find them very interesting.
Right, it's, is it learning about a language or actually developing the language that you have? They are interesting, and sometimes learning something interesting gives you that little motivational kick to keep going with the language. I also think it depends on your learning style. Sometimes that type of information doesn't necessarily have a purpose depending on the individual's learning style. So I think you've got to find what works for you and then lean into that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are good points. It depends on the person. I mean, that's usually a pretty appropriate answer to say it depends. But yeah, I think it seems like the message of our conversation so far is that it's about staying motivated and about sticking to a daily habit. So if you find those resources helpful for you or motivating for you, then it's good. If they bum you out, then don't look at them.
And can I just add, so many times students come to me and they're like, point out my mistakes. What have I done wrong? And I just want to say that it's really important to also identify your strengths, and that you get good outcomes when you practice your strengths, when you take something you do well and you develop it more. I think that can balance out sometimes the discouragement we may feel when we're working on one of our weaknesses in the language. And I think that, yeah, you want to develop the weaknesses, but don't neglect your strengths, because sometimes taking something you do well and trying to do that even better can really push you over or get you through those difficult humps.
Yeah, that's all very good advice. And speaking of improving on weaknesses, the next question is, what are some good strategies for improving my advanced vocabulary, maybe like academic vocabulary?
I know we're starting to come up on things that we've said before, but I mean, input is really the key to this, meaning finding things that you're interested in to read or listen to will definitely help expose you to new words. Another thing that I relate to this question is when I was studying for like a graduate test, like the GRE, I used to carry those flashcards around with me in my daily life and practice them while I was waiting in line. And that's, one thing that I was doing to learn new words and just try to advance my vocabulary. But it's sticking with something that you're interested in is definitely going to help.
Yeah, that's great advice, Eve. And I just want to add that one of the things I've done to improve my Spanish is I take a book that I've read multiple times in English and I read it in Spanish, because I have the context. I have most of the main points, and I have already I understand what's happening. And that can help fill in so many gaps when I'm reading in my additional language. And it can help me continue reading without stopping to look up a word, or it can give me a sense of what's happening on the page, even when it's full of words or grammar that I'm unfamiliar with. So if you don't have a book in your first language, find another input source, like maybe a newspaper that you can read first in one language and then read again in another. And I think what Eve said, it's got to be compelling and interesting to you. And then I think one more thing to say, and we've said this before, is that you don't want to just keep that vocabulary in your passive repertoire. If you're going to use it in the productive skills, you want to practice moving it from the passive repertoire to the active by speaking those words and writing those words. And I think that the more you do that, the more you access the resources that you passively know and move them into the active, the stronger those connections in your brain get. And each time you do it, the less time it takes to produce until you're more and more fluent with this advanced vocabulary.
Elizabeth, that actually reminds me of something. I'm a big vocabulary flashcard person when I'm learning a language. And I remember I was studying Arabic at the time, and I went to a presentation that said that rather than writing just the word and then the translation or the definition on the back, that really put the word in context, learn it in a phrase, and that will help move that from a passive, isolated meaning into a more contextualized, and might move that to the active in a faster, more efficient way.
Yeah, I love that advice, like learning it in context. Like when I lived in several countries in Asia and taught English, and I would see students just, rote memorizing lists of words maybe without even definitions. And so that seems like it's more efficient for sure to learn it in a sentence, learn it in context. And I love the advice to read. I mean, I've gotten that advice when learning languages, and that's what I've tried to practice as well. Just the more you read, the more words you see, and the more times you see the words, the more likely you'll recognize them and understand them in the future. So next question that we have is, what if we run out of time and cannot submit our response? Will it be auto-submitted? The short answer is yes. So if you are speaking or writing all the way up until the time limit, whatever you have put in for that question will be automatically submitted. So you don't need to worry about that. But it seems like this is maybe there's a more general question here about time management. So Eve and Elizabeth, do either of you have anything to add about how to, I mean, I think we've touched on this topic already, but do you have more to say about how to, plan your time when responding to questions? Should you just try to say as much as possible until the limit, or should you speak very carefully and slowly?
I love that question because I think a lot of times students might associate fast speaking quickly with, proficiency and fluency. And so I think that mimicking the natural rhythm, adding the strategic pausing, adding intonation to convey meaning, and making sure that you're speaking clearly is far more important than producing a lot of language very quickly. Because often when we do that, we tend to lose a lot of the stress and the meaning and the emphasis, and it becomes harder to understand for the listener. So slowing down, inserting the pauses where they make sense grammatically, and including that stress is really important in the speaking tasks.
I would just add, here's where test readiness comes in, right? Knowing what the time limit is for the different types. Definitely check out Eve's DET workshop video series for that type of information. And the more you know about time limits, the less they'll surprise you.
All good points. And I'll just reiterate, say again that the Duolingo English Test Readiness Guide does have information like this, the time limits for each question type. And then, yes, the Penn ELP video series is an excellent resource to understand these time limits and the intricacies of each question type. And speaking of running out of time, we are close to the end of our broadcast. We have one question to finish off. What, if you could just give sort of one piece of your best advice to prepare for the Duolingo English Test, what would it be?
I'd say know what to expect. Check out the readiness guide on Duolingo's DET website, take a practice test, but also just do what you would normally do when studying a language. Read more, listen more, practice writing, practice speaking. All of those things will help you. There's no secret structure that's tested on the DET that isn't taught in an English language program or an English language course. So continue, stick with it, keep doing what you're doing, and check out the practice test too.
That was a really comprehensive response from Eve. And I think, try not, I'm just gonna repeat what I said before, try not to get hung up too much on your mistakes, where you think, your weaknesses are. We often get students talking about, pronunciation, like what sounds could I make better? But honestly, way more important than individual sounds is, word stress. Are you, and sentence stress? Are you really emphasizing the main idea or the key information for your listener? So doing what Eve said, all the things you do on a day-to-day basis to engage with English, the blogs and books you read, the podcasts you listen to, the TV shows you watch, and the people you talk to, is going to help give you that English endurance you need to really perform your best.
Great advice to close us out. Well, thank you both again so much for joining us for our first Ask Us Anything. Please, everyone viewing, please be sure to check out the Penn ELP and their awesome resources on the Duolingo English Test. Those are linked in the comments again. And if you have any ideas for other topics for us to cover in future videos, please ask, you can post that in the comments as well. So thank you both again. Thank you to all our viewers, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for having us.
Good
Bye.
luck, everyone.